They told us that education would set us free, that it would open the doors of opportunity, help us understand the world, and shape us into wise, capable individuals, ready to thrive. But if that's true, why do so many of us leave school feeling confused, uninspired, and disconnected from our deepest selves? Why do we chase grades, degrees, and certificates like currency, only to wake up years later and realize we were never taught how to think, only what to think? That perhaps, just perhaps, we were not educated, but programmed. Somewhere between the morning bell and the final exam, something sacred was lost. And if you've ever sat in a classroom feeling like your soul was elsewhere wandering, daydreaming, questioning, you're not alone. That quiet discomfort wasn't laziness. It was your spirit resisting confinement. Your inner compass alerting you to something deeply unnatural about the way we are taught to learn. Modern education is hailed as the great equalizer, the ticket to success, the noble path to self-actualization. But beneath the surface of institutional polish lies a system shaped not by wisdom, but by obedience. It was never truly designed to liberate the individual, but to mold them, to make them useful, employable, manageable. The irony is devastating. We spend our most imaginative, curious, and malleable years being taught to ignore our intuition, to suppress wonder, and to pursue metrics over meaning. This isn't just a modern dilemma. The tension between real education and societal programming has been present for centuries. Socrates was sentenced to death for corrupting the youth by teaching them to question authority. The ancient Chinese philosopher Confucius battled against rigid systems that favored rote memorization over wisdom. Even in medieval monasteries, education was a privilege, tightly controlled, meant to preserve order, not provoke transformation. And yet, we keep pretending the system works. We keep sending children into institutions that prepare them for tests, not for life. We call it success when someone becomes a doctor, engineer, or lawyer, even if their soul is quietly decaying from unmet dreams and unlived truth. We shame the artist, mock the wanderer, pity the philosopher. Because somewhere along the line, society decided that learning was a means to employment, not enlightenment. This script is not an attack on learning, but a plea for reclaiming what learning was always meant to be: a sacred process of awakening, a remembering, a return to curiosity, critical thinking, and inner freedom. We're not here to bash teachers or glorify rebellion. We're here to go deeper, to ask uncomfortable questions, to understand how we got here, most importantly, how we get out. Because the truth is, you were never meant to fit in. You were meant to become. An education, when pure, was supposed to be the fire that helps you burn away everything false. Are you ready to walk through the illusion? To truly understand the deception of modern education, we must begin with a painful truth. Our current system was not built to enlighten the individual. It was built to serve the machine of society. The Industrial Revolution, often celebrated as an era of innovation and growth, did something else just as significant. It defined the purpose of human beings. Suddenly, a person was not valued for their insight or soulfulness, but for their utility, their productivity, their ability to obey instructions, follow schedules, and repeat tasks without questioning them. So, what kind of education system would a society like that need? One that mass produces sameness, one that punishes deviation and rewards conformity. The modern school system, as we know it, owes much of its structure to 19th century Prussia. The Prussian model of education was meticulously designed not to foster free thinkers, but to create obedient soldiers and civil servants. It introduced standardized testing, rigid classroom hierarchies, bells that signaled time blocks like factory shifts, and a strict curriculum that emphasized memorization over exploration. Its purpose was clear: to produce efficient, compliant citizens who would serve the needs of the state. Horace Mann, often called the father of American public education, imported many of these ideas to the United States in the mid-1800s. And while his intentions may have been noble, creating a more literate and unified society, what we inherited was not a system built for enlightenment, but one engineered for control. It prioritized uniformity over individuality, competition over collaboration, and performance over passion. We became students of obedience, not seekers of truth. Ancient civilizations, by contrast, approached education in profoundly different ways. In ancient Greece, education was not seen as a path to employment, it was a path to virtue. The Greek word for education, paideia, meant the shaping of the soul. It was about cultivating wisdom, courage, and ethical character. Socrates didn't lecture. He asked questions. He didn't fill minds, unlock them. His goal was not to produce citizens who could memorize facts, but ones who could examine their own lives. In ancient India, the Gurukul system placed the student in the home of a spiritual teacher. Education was a holistic process. Students learned philosophy, art, mathematics, spirituality, and the practical skills of life. The emphasis was not on passing tests, but on integrating knowledge with inner development. Learning was sacred, intimate, slow. You didn't graduate after 12 years, you evolved. The Islamic Golden Age, too, offers a glimpse of a different educational spirit. Scholars in Baghdad's House of Wisdom translated and expanded upon Greek, Persian, and Indian texts. They debated metaphysics, medicine, mathematics, and mysticism. They were not afraid to blend science with soul, reason with revelation. Education was not about churning out employees, it was about awakening the mind and heart to the vastness of reality. But as time passed and empires expanded, a more utilitarian view of education began to dominate. Colonial powers used education as a weapon of cultural erasure. British-ruled India, for example, Lord Macaulay's infamous Minute on Indian education argued that the purpose of education was to create a class of persons, Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. Education was no longer about truth, it was about obedience to empire. Minds were to be trained, not liberated. The deception here is subtle, yet deep. Society dressed up this system in the language of progress and meritocracy. Work hard in school and you'll succeed. Get good grades and you'll be happy. But what we were never told is that this success often comes at the cost of authenticity. That the system itself was never designed to nurture uniqueness, but to erase it. And so we entered the classroom, each of us a unique constellation of talents, questions, and dreams, and were handed the same textbook, the same test, the same metrics of worth. We were praised for sitting still, punished for curiosity that wandered too far. We learned to fear failure, to chase approval, to internalize the idea that our worth was tied to performance. Slowly, imperceptibly, we became strangers to our inner life. This isn't to say there haven't been brave souls within the system, teachers who ignited sparks, mentors who taught us to think. But they've had to work despite the structure, not because of it. The system doesn't reward deep thinkers, it rewards good test takers. It doesn't honor emotional intelligence. It quantifies intelligence through narrow metrics. It doesn't cultivate wonder. It extinguishes it in favor of efficiency. What's most tragic is that this model continues today, largely unquestioned. We still treat children like empty vessels to be filled, not flames to be lit. We still use grades as a proxy for intelligence and degrees as a proxy for wisdom. We still equate schooling with education as if they are the same thing. But they are not. Education, in its truest form, is not a commodity. It is a transformation. It is what happens when you wrestle with ideas, question your assumptions, and awaken to your own depths. It cannot be confined to four walls or reduced to a syllabus. Real education happens when the soul is moved. So here we are in the 21st century, armed with technology, surrounded by information, and yet many are more lost than ever. Not because we aren't learning, but because we aren't being taught how to live, how to think for ourselves, how to navigate meaning in a chaotic world. And that is the great deception. mistaking schooling for learning, degrees for wisdom, and knowledge for understanding. Until we question that lie, we remain trapped educated, perhaps, but not enlightened. What if education is not just about what is taught, but what is implied, expected, and internalized without ever being spoken aloud? Psychologists and sociologists call this the hidden curriculum, the silent shaping of our identity, values, and worldview that occurs beneath the surface of formal education. It's not just algebra or grammar. We absorb the invisible lessons about obedience, competition, conformity, and self-worth. And these unspoken lessons often leave the deepest scars. From a psychological perspective, the modern education system is less about self-actualization and more about conditioning. Think of B.F. Skinner's operant conditioning model. Behaviors are reinforced through rewards and punishments. In school, praise is reserved for those who comply, those who follow instructions, meet deadlines, and regurgitate expected answers. Curiosity that strays too far from the curriculum is often met with red ink or silence. Over time, children learn not just facts, but how to suppress their natural instincts to question, explore, and express. This creates what Carl Jung, the humanistic psychologist, described as a condition of worth. We begin to internalize the idea that we are valuable only when we meet external expectations. If we get an A, we are smart. If we fail, we are failures. This binary thinking, reward or rejection, teaches children that love, approval, and success are conditional. The tragedy: most carry this mindset into adulthood, forever chasing external validation and fearing that they are never enough. Carl Jung might have called this the slow death of the self. In his view, education should guide the individual toward individuation, the process of becoming whole by integrating all parts of oneself: the conscious, the unconscious, the shadow, the dreamer, the rebel. But modern education often does the opposite. It fragments the self. It tells the artist to sit still. It tells the dreamer to get practical. It silences the emotional child and exalts the rational one. The result: adults who are technically competent, but spiritually hollow. This psychological fragmentation is not accidentally, it's a byproduct of a system designed for predictability, not wholeness. In a society that values productivity over presence, and performance over introspection, education becomes less about becoming and more about achieving. And yet, we wonder why so many bright, educated individuals suffer from anxiety, depression, or a pervasive sense of something missing. They have followed the script, but lost themselves in the process. Let's also consider the Pygmalion effect, a social psychology phenomenon showing that people tend to perform in line with the expectations placed upon them. In schools, this can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. If a teacher believes a student is average, they might unconsciously give them less attention or encouragement. That student, absorbing the belief, may stop trying. But if a teacher believes in their potential, something magical can happen. The child begins to rise. What does this tell us? That the soul is responsive to belief, that identity is co-authored by the mirrors around us. But what happens when those mirrors are cracked? When the system sees you not as a human being, but as a data point, a future employee, a number on a chart. You begin to see yourself that way too. You stop asking, who am I? And start asking, how do I fit? You measure your life not by joy or meaning, but by milestones: graduation, employment, promotion, retirement. Then what? The comparison trap is another byproduct of educational structures. From the earliest age, we are pitted against one another. Who got the highest grade? Who made honor roll? Is going to the best college? Fosters a subtle, chronic sense of inadequacy. We learn to see peers not as collaborators, but as competitors. Social psychologist Leon Festinger's social comparison theory suggests that people evaluate their worth based on how they stack up against others. Education, through ranking, grading, and sorting, hardwires this mindset into our psyches. This might explain why, even decades after school, many people still feel the need to prove themselves, to outshine, outperform, outhustle. We're not chasing excellence, we're trying to silence the ghost of not being enough. The fear of being average haunts the modern soul, not because we lack value, but because we were never taught to see it beyond the rubric. And what about failure? In most educational systems, failure is seen as shameful, a red mark, a lost opportunity. But in psychological reality, failure is the crucible of growth. The great spiritual traditions, from Sufism to Stoicism, understood this. Rumi wrote, "Try not to resist the changes that come your way. Instead, let life live through you." But school teaches the opposite. It teaches us to fear mistakes, to avoid risks, to seek safety and certainty. And so, we become adults who are risk-averse, afraid to leap, trapped in lives that feel small but safe. Contrast this with ancient ways of learning. In indigenous cultures, learning was relational, experiential, and intergenerational. Children learned by doing, by watching elders, by making mistakes, and being held in compassion, not punished. Education wasn't separate from life, was life. A child learned to farm, to dance, to meditate, to navigate the stars, not for a diploma, but for survival and meaning. There were no multiple choice questions, only the choice to keep learning, to stay awake, to remain connected. The modern system, by contrast, fragments learning into subjects, boxes it into classrooms, and isolates it from nature, emotion, and the sacred. The soul, confused by this disintegration, begins to shut down. The result: a generation of high-achieving individuals who don't know how to listen to their own inner voice. Yet, the hunger for meaning remains. That is why, in recent decades, there's been a rise in alternative education models, Montessori, Waldorf, unschooling, and more. These systems try to restore a sense of agency and soulfulness to learning, but they are still niche, often inaccessible, and struggling against the momentum of a deeply entrenched industrial model. So where does that leave us? Well, the paradox. We live in the most educated time in history, and yet many feel lost, numb, anxious, or directionless. We have more access to knowledge than ever, and yet we struggle to access wisdom. We have been trained to succeed in the world, yet many of us feel we've failed ourselves. And perhaps that is the greatest psychological deception of all, that education is about survival in the system, not awakening to the soul. That intelligence is measured in speed, scores, and specialization, not in stillness, insight, and depth. But here's the truth. Your soul has always known. You are not a machine. You are not a number, okay? You are not here to meet a quota, okay? You are here to remember. Imagine a child who grows up believing that her worth depends entirely on performance, on how quietly she can sit, how quickly she can memorize, how perfectly she can fit into someone else's mold. That child grows up, gets a degree, finds a job, and still feels like something's missing, because deep down, she was never seen for who she truly was, only measured, only shaped, only managed. This is not an isolated story. T is a silent suffering of millions. We don't often speak about the emotional and spiritual consequences of modern education, but they are profound. Anxiety, perfectionism, shame, a disconnection from one's inner voice, a chronic fear of failure, an inability to rest without guilt. Okay. These are not random symptoms. Okay. They are the psychological residue of a system that taught us to live for approval, to fear judgment, and to suppress everything that didn't earn a grade. Children are born with a natural curiosity, a hunger for meaning, a desire to explore and create. But modern education often doesn't know what to do with that wildness. It trims it down, files it into subjects, puts it on a schedule. Over time, this produces not wonder but wariness, not insight but burnout. So many gifted children grow up into adults who no longer read for pleasure, no longer ask questions that don't have practical value, no longer trust their own voice, unless it's validated by someone else. The consequences show up everywhere. It's careers that look perfect on paper but feel empty in the soul. In relationships that suffer because one or both partners never learned how to be emotionally present. In adults who are so terrified of making mistakes that they stay in jobs they hate. Friendships that are draining, or roles that slowly extinguish their light. In therapists' offices and silent morning commutes, the symptoms speak. I followed the rules. Why do I still feel lost? In his work on trauma, Dr. Gabor often notes that trauma is not just what happens to you, it's what happens inside you as a result of what happens to you. And for many, school was a trauma they never named. Not because of overt abuse, but because of the slow, steady erasure of their authenticity. Being told again and again in subtle ways that who you are is not enough, that what matters is who you can pretend to be. Think of the child who loved to draw, but was told art wasn't a real career. The boy who daydreamed and asked strange questions, but was diagnosed with a learning disorder. The girl who got straight A's, but never felt seen, only praised for her performance. Okay? These are not just anecdotes, they are emotional archetypes. Okay? They reveal a deep soul wound, the wound of becoming what the world wants, instead of discovering what you truly are. Even success becomes hollow when it is built on this kind of internal exile. Many of the most accomplished people in the world will confess, quietly, that they feel like imposters, that they don't really know who they are beneath the armor of achievement. This is not because they failed at education, but because education failed them. Okay, it taught them how to succeed outwardly, but not how to feel whole inwardly. Jung once warned, the greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parent. But what about the unlived life of the student, the artist never born, the philosopher never encouraged, the healer who became a banker, the quiet mystic who became a corporate strategist? The tragedy of modern education is that it too often shapes people to fit the world, rather than helping them reshape the world with their unique gifts. Even our relationships suffer under this hidden pressure. It's because when we're taught to suppress emotion, to ignore intuition, to prioritize logic and output, we enter adulthood emotionally illiterate. Hey, we don't know how to sit with discomfort, how to grieve, how to hold space for someone else's pain. Emotional intelligence is not part of the curriculum, and so many of us are left navigating complex human relationships with tools meant for solving algebra equations. What's more, the lack of true self-awareness cultivated in early education leads to poor boundaries, misaligned careers, and burnout disguised as ambition. We overwork because we never learned to listen to our limits. We stay in toxic environments because we were never taught to trust our gut. We please others endlessly because we were rewarded for doing so. This is not just a personal issue, it is a collective one. A society filled with people who don't know who they are becomes easy to manipulate, easy to distract, easy to divide. Even history repeats this theme. Consider the myth of Icarus, taught to fly, but never taught balance. He soared too close to the sun and fell. Or the story of Siddhartha, Gautama Buddha, who was educated as a prince but found no peace in the palace. True wisdom came not from his schooling, but from his disillusionment. Or Rumi, who was once a scholar of law and religion, but only became a poet of the soul after Shams shattered his conventional understanding of truth. In every age, we see the same pattern. It is often in unlearning that the true journey begins. Today, we're seeing a generational shift. Young people are waking up. They're questioning, dropping out, seeking meaning over money. But many are also deeply anxious, confused, and overwhelmed. They were told the world was a meritocracy, but they're seeing that credentials don't equal clarity, that education doesn't always guarantee wisdom, that something vital is missing and they're trying to name it. The good news, the soul is resilient. And though it may be buried beneath years of programming, performance, and pressure, it's never lost. It waits, it watches, it whispers, and that whisper is growing louder, because real education doesn't end with the diploma. It begins when you decide to take your power back, to question everything you were taught, to seek what truly nourishes you, to unlearn the fear of failure, the addiction to approval, the belief that your worth must be proven. The deception of modern education may have wounded us, but it also gave us a map of what not to do. And from that, we can begin to create something new. Not just a better system, but a better self. If the classroom failed, if it taught you to memorize, but not to feel, to conform, but not to question, then you are not broken. You are simply overdue for a different kind of learning. The soul has its own curriculum, and when traditional education leaves you disconnected from yourself, the task is not to despair, but to return to the sacred process of self-education, of remembering who you are without the noise. So, where do we begin? The first step is unlearning. This doesn't mean throwing away everything you know, but rather questioning what you've accepted without consent. Ask yourself, who told me what success looks like? Whose voice is in my head when I doubt myself? What beliefs about intelligence, productivity, and worth am I still carrying? Unlearning is an act of spiritual decluttering. It creates space for your real voice to emerge, the voice that was silenced when the grade was more important than the question. Start journaling, not for productivity, but for truth. Let it be messy. Let it be honest. Let it be yours. Write about the first time you felt stupid, the first time you felt unseen, the first time you chose safety over your soul. These are not just memories, they are emotional root systems. And when we excavate them, we begin to understand why we fear failure, why we sabotage growth, why we chase approval. This is the beginning of psychological liberation. From there, we move into relearning, not from textbooks, but from life. It's where modern psychology and ancient wisdom can meet. Practices like mindfulness, cognitive behavioral therapy, and inner child work can help rewire the brain's learned associations between failure and shame, productivity and worth. CBT, for example, invites you to challenge the core beliefs installed by schooling. If I'm not achieving, I'm falling behind. I'm not praised, I'm invisible. Replace these with truths rooted in your experience, not in your programming. Carl Jung believed in the power of active imagination, a meditative state in which you dialogue with parts of yourself. The inner critic, the wounded child, the unlived artist, the denied mystic. These parts still live in you, and they're waiting not to be erased, but reintegrated. The school might have told you who you should be. Your task now is to remember who you actually are. One transformative practice is reading differently. It's not for exams, not for status, but for nourishment. Pick up the works of mystics, rebels, artists, and thinkers who defied convention. Rumi, Nietzsche, James Baldwin, Bell Hooks, Krishnamurti. These voices challenge not only systems, but the deeper internalized beliefs that sustain them. Let their words be seeds in the soil that traditional education neglected. Alongside this, embrace the power of conscious solitude. Turn off the noise. Spend time in nature. Walk without a destination. Let your senses reawaken. You were never meant to live only from your head. The body is wise. The heart is wise. In a society obsessed with outcomes, solitude becomes rebellion. Stillness becomes clarity. You remember that there is a rhythm to life beyond the bell schedule, and yes, bring structure to your inner learning. Not like a rigid school day, but like a sacred ritual. Create time each day for something soul-affirming. Journaling, reading, movement, prayer, painting, silence. Let this be your true curriculum of becoming. No grades, no applause. It's just a quiet unfolding of the authentic self. It's also time to redefine what success means to you. The system taught you that success is a straight line degree, job, salary, house. But in reality, success is cyclical. You grow, you fall, you rest, you rise again. In Sufi wisdom, the journey to truth is not linear, it spirals inward. You return again and again to the same wound, the same question, the same yearning, but with deeper awareness each time. That is growth. That is education. In practical terms, this also means learning emotional literacy, naming your feelings, understanding your patterns, and developing compassion for yourself. Resources like internal family systems therapy can be powerful here. It teaches that we are made of parts, some of which protect us, some of which hold pain, and some of which carry our core essence. School taught us to ignore or suppress these parts. Real education invites them back into the conversation. We must also reimagine community, not as competition, but as co-learning. Find people who are unlearning with you. Read together, reflect together, cry and laugh together. Healing doesn't happen in isolation. It happens in resonance. Create spaces where being human is not a flaw, but a gift. Where failure is not shameful, but sacred. Where learning is not performance, but presence. And while modern tools like therapy and coaching are invaluable, we can also turn to ancient practices for deeper integration. Meditation, breathwork, stoic journaling, contemplative prayer. These practices slow the mind and recenter the soul. The Stoics believed that philosophy wasn't something you learned, it was something you practiced. Marcus Aurelius journaled to himself every day, not for an audience, but for alignment. What if you did the same? Finally, remember, education is not just about acquiring knowledge, it's about becoming wise. And wisdom does not require a classroom. It requires attention, reflection, a willingness to live the questions. You don't need permission to begin this journey. You only need presence. The most powerful education you will ever receive is the one you give yourself. And it begins the moment you stop trying to fit in and start trying to feel whole. Let go of the fantasy that someone else will give you the answer. Instead, trust that you already hold the question that matters. So now we arrive at the end, but perhaps, more truthfully, at the beginning. The beginning of an education that doesn't end with a diploma or a ceremony, but with the moment of stillness. A moment when you look around at the life you've built or the one you've inherited and ask, is this really mine? We were told that education would give us answers. But the deeper truth is, real education awakens better questions, strips away illusions, it unsettles you. It forces you to unlearn what is false, to challenge what is inherited, to excavate what is buried. And that is not something that happens once. In youth it happens again and again throughout your life. Maybe you feel the ache of missed paths. The career that you chose to please others. The creative spark you buried to be practical. The way you were praised for your grades, but never asked about your dreams. You are not alone. This is the quiet grief of a generation that followed the rules and still felt lost. But here's the beautiful, defiant truth. It is never too late to begin again. Because the soul does not care about your resume. It cares that you are alive, awake, aligned. And the greatest education is not about mastering the world, it's about mastering yourself. The ancient Greeks carved into the temple of Apollo at Delphi the words, know thyself, not know your syllabus or know your market value, but know your soul, your desires, your patterns, your fears, your truths. That is the foundation of wisdom. That is the education you are meant to receive, not from a textbook, but from the sacred curriculum of experience. To know yourself is to become dangerous in the best way. Dangerous to false narratives. Dangerous to systems that profit from your confusion. It's dangerous to those who benefit when you doubt your own light. When you reclaim your mind, you reclaim your life. And that is the real revolution. And yet, this journey requires immense tenderness. Because as you begin to peel away the layers of conditioning, of performance, of internalized shame, you will encounter pain. You'll revisit classrooms where you felt unseen, families that praised your achievements but misunderstood your essence, jobs that paid your bills but drained your spirit. But if you can meet that pain with compassion, not judgment, something powerful begins to happen. You begin to rewrite the narrative. Start to understand that your value is not in what you produce, but in who you are. That rest is not laziness. That failure is not weakness. That confusion is not a flaw, an opening to something deeper, more honest, more real. And from that place, a new kind of learner is born. One who is no longer afraid to be misunderstood. One who is willing to walk away from what is popular in order to protect what is true. One who listens not to the loudest voices, but to the quiet truth within. This is not easy work, but it is sacred work. Because when you reclaim your own education, you don't just heal yourself, heal the collective. You become a parent who raises children with emotional depth, not just academic success. A teacher who awakens, not just instructs. A leader who values wisdom over status. A creator who dares to share something real. This is the ripple effect of personal awakening. In the end, we must ask, what kind of world are we building if our most educated minds are anxious, disconnected, and spiritually numb? What is the point of progress if it leads us further from ourselves? Maybe true progress is not forward, but inward. Maybe the real classroom is life itself. The heartbreaks, the failures, the late-night questions, the small acts of courage, the books that awaken, the conversations that stir, the silence that teaches. And maybe, just maybe, the real diploma is not a piece of paper, but a soul that is whole again. So here's your invitation, not to drop out of school, but to drop back into yourself, to question everything you were taught about success, to rebuild your definition of intelligence. To remember that your mind is not a machine, it is a mirror, a map, a mystery. And in that remembering, we begin to heal. Because you were never meant to be manufactured. You were meant to be discovered. If this message stirred something in you, don't let it fade. The world doesn't need more perfectly educated machines. It needs awakened souls. People who dare to think for themselves. People who are brave enough to say, I want more than just survival. I want meaning. Start small. Question one belief you've always carried. Pick up a book that challenges your worldview. Have a conversation that makes you uncomfortable, but honest. Write about your pain. Paint your truth. Sit in silence long enough to hear your real voice. That is where the true education begins, not in the system, but in the soul. And if this video resonated with you, share it, because someone else out there is quietly wondering why their degree didn't save them. Someone else is tired of pretending that success feels fulfilling when it doesn't. Someone else is waiting for permission to begin again. Be that mirror for them. You don't need another certificate to be wise. You don't need another lecture to be free. You just need the courage to remember who you are. This is your revolution. This is your real graduation. It's in the classroom. It's life itself.